Everyone, welcome to our first lecture for our labor economics course. Today we're going to be covering chapter 1, which is just a brief introduction to labor economics. Now I apologize, these PowerPoints are a little bit boring. There were no PowerPoints that came from the textbook that has all, the fancy stuff built into it, so I had to build these myself. So our focus for this class is going to be different topics in labor economics. What we're going to try to do is combine the boring, dry economic theory, the kind of stuff that I enjoy, with practical examples, so things you'll actually be able to take with you and use in your career in HR. So let's first by thinking about what is economics. So economics is the study of human choice subject to constraints. Now, it might have been a while since you've had an econ course. You might have hated it so much you blocked it out from your memory. So I'll try to make this as painless as possible. But I'll have to admit, since I'm weird enough to actually enjoy economics, I can't promise that I'll be successful with that. So to start from the beginning, what are we doing? What tools are we going to use? How are we going to look at the world? These are the kind of things we're going to build up. We're first thinking about economics. Now, the reason why we choose to study this is because of scarcity. There will always be scarcity. Our wants are greater than our resources. Because of this, it's always going to be present. Even if we're able to increase production, we're still not be able to get all the things that we want. Because of that, we have to make choices. What is the most important thing? What are we going to produce? How are we going to produce it? Without scarcity, we don't need to make these decisions about how to allocate resources, so there's no need for economics. In the sort of post-scarcity world that people hope for in the future, where all of our needs can be met, we won't have to decide what to produce and how, because we'll have everything. But in the meantime, we're stuck in this world where we have to decide. We have to make these tough decisions. So the word economics comes from the Greek word oikonomia, which basically means the management of household affairs. I think this definition is lacking, which is why I included our earlier definition, the study of human choice. It's also sometimes called catalytics. We're trying to model and understand human interaction. The great economist Ludwig von Mises chose the title of his magnum opus, his great work on economics, is human action. Now, it's typically how humans relate to each other, act and interact in a market setting, basically as buyers and sellers. But we can look at other areas where we also relate to each other, how we relate to each other in these different contexts. So for instance, in a introductory to econ course I taught, the last couple classes I do something a little fun, applying some of the tools that we learned. So we looked at things like gypsy law, at markets that formed spontaneously in POW camps in World War II, European witch trials, and trying to understand decision-making behind crime. We can take the tools of economics and apply them to all these different sorts of areas, not just within a market setting, trying to look at buyers and sellers. In this course, we're going to be focusing on labor markets. So that means workers, firms, and other institutions. Now, in economics, we use institutions to mean well-established arrangements and structures that are part of culture or society. So kind of a broad definition, but because it can be a whole lot of things. So it can be like the free market itself, relying on market mechanisms to allocate resources to their highest value uses. It can be things like the protection of private property rights, a court and legal system, or even specific labor market institutions, so things like occupational licensing. So labor economics in this course, it's going to be the study of factors that underpin the choices made concerning wages, employment, and other terms and conditions of employment. So mainstream economic typically uses the following 3 steps in their analysis. So first is the collection and analysis of data to recognize problems. We need to look at the world around us to figure out what is wrong and to be able to ask these questions. Once we notice this, once we have something, we apply economic theory to these problems, trying to understand why they're occurring and what we can do to solve them. And we also collect and analyze more data. So we go back to that first step, gathering more data so we can test the predictions of the theory. So the economic theory that's most commonly used is called neoclassical theory. Now this is based on utility maximizing individuals that act rationally. Now, what we mean by utility is just trying to maximize their enjoyment or pleasure, these positive feelings, these good things, trying to more of good things, less of bad things. And in economics, when we say rational, we mean someone choosing to act in their own self-interest. That means choosing the best way to satisfy our needs, not the second best way or the third best way to satisfy our needs. That's not to say that we're robots or that we only think of ourselves. So sometimes we can derive some sort of enjoyment or some utility from helping others. So not to sound like the crazy, like Ayn Rand follower, but engaging in charity, actually going and helping people, consumers or people still derive some sort of benefit from that. You feel good from helping people in your community. You're glad to live, in a community where people are helping one another. So we do get some benefit from it. So that's not just to say that we're only focused on ourselves and how to make us as happy as possible when we're talking about individuals being rational. It's just choosing the best way to satisfy our needs. If you're presented with the best option and the second best option, you would choose the best option. I think the neoclassical school is a great base, especially when we're working with labor economics, but it does make some abstractions from real life that we're going to have to consider. And we'll get into those in a little more detail when we get to those points in the class. So like when we get to supply and demand analysis later, I'll mention a little bit about the Austrian school's critique on too much static analysis. I know right now this sounds kind of like Greek, but we will focus, I will explain this a little more in depth when we actually get to it, and it'll make a lot more sense, especially just when we use models, we kind of assume away some of the problems of the real world. We need to make it simpler so we're able to work with it. That's why we use a model in the first place, so it's simple enough for us to work with. So there's sometimes if we get too simple, I'll talk about some of the drawbacks so we can remember, so we can see where it doesn't quite live up to reality, what difference between that model and reality really is. Now, unlike a lot of other economic fields, labor econ really relies on data. Part of it is because we just have so much available for us, so we're able to test our hypotheses. And in a few of the chapters, things like minimum wage, unions, occupational licensing, we will talk some about what the research says the effects of these different institutions are. But it's not going to be something that you have to go through and do yourself. I'm not going to expect you to be writing these sort of research papers relying on this data, but we'll use some of it in this class. So now the question, how are employees' salaries determined? Well, a labor economist exploring this question would instantly turn to supply and demand to help understand this. So in a labor market, the buyers and sellers interact just like in a regular market. In this case, the buyers of labor are firms and the sellers of labor are the workers themselves. Now, the market is how we choose to coordinate resources in the United States, and we use the price mechanism to signal the relative value of goods or services, and we use the price mechanism to incentivize people to use resources in the most efficient way. Same thing is going to happen in the labor market. So firms are going to try to use these resources the most efficient way. They're not going to hire more workers than they need and that they think they need. And the price mechanism, or in this case, salaries, are going to encourage people, to go places where they can make more money or where they're valued more by the firms. So buyers and sellers, they come together to negotiate prices, in this case, employment contracts. And eventually the market will settle on an equilibrium price that results in both buyers and sellers being happy. So both workers and firms eventually happy with who they find to work, so the company they choose to work for, or the employees that they find, and the salary that's being paid. Now, labor demand, or how many employees and what type of employees that a firm wants, are a result of two things. So the first is consumer demand for a product. That should be straightforward. If people only want 100 units of whatever product in a year, I might only employ 3 people to produce that. But if consumers are going to want 100 million in a year, I'll need a lot more employees. Now, the second is less straightforward. What we mean by the production function is how employees interact with capital inputs and each other. Basically, what this means is how firms choose to produce things and how productive those employees actually are. As we increase workers' productivity, as they can, produce more output of whatever product we're talking about in the same amount of time, we're going to see a lower demand for workers. Now, the main thing that determines the labor supply, which we're going to explore later in some detail, is the trade-off between leisure and income to purchase products. Most people aren't like Ebenezer Scrooge, who just enjoys having money around. They like having money so they can actually purchase things with it. Most people prefer to not work than to actually do work. That's why we get paid to do it. But we also prefer, living in a nice house or an apartment over building our own cabins in the woods and living off the land with no income whatsoever. So we are forced to work some amount. How much we do choose to work is going to differ based on each person. But we'll see later, for instance, that the highest income earners in the US work much longer hours than everyone else. So maybe they potentially gain some utility from work. They actually enjoy it, or they enjoy some of the non-pecuniary benefits of just being on top of their field.